All right, so I'm going to get started. My name is Marianne Hadzopoulou. I'm a professor in civil and mineral engineering at the University of Toronto. I'm also the director of Positive Zero Transport Futures, which is a very recently established center at the University of Toronto that received seed funding from the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. And our focus is mostly on learning how to decarbonize transportation by enabling pilot projects, pilot studies, and addressing these questions at a local and community context. Today, I'm very happy to kick off our first seminar, part of a series that we've entitled Place-Based Solutions for Decarbonizing Transport. We want to go across the world and we want to learn about what cities are doing, what communities are doing in regard to transport decarbonization. The title of today's seminar or panel is Roadmap for Emission-Free Road Transport and Healthy Urban Living. And we have a great set of speakers from across the world talking about various perspectives towards a fair, a just, a healthy decarbonization from various different contexts. I'll introduce the speakers a little bit later on, but right now I'm going to just move it to my colleague, Sham Gamage. Sham is a postdoc in my group. She comes from an atmospheric physics background. She's been leading a lot of work on the co-benefits of transport decarbonization for air quality and for health benefits, which are often a very big co-benefit of decarbonization. She also wears another hat. She's the director of strategic partnerships for Positive Zero, and she'll be introducing our initiative very briefly, as well as two other initiatives also seated at the University of Toronto, who are co-sponsoring this event and with whom we have very strong ties as well.
Thank you, Marianne, for the introduction. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining with us today. I'm going to introduce our initiative first. So Positive Zero is the transport decarbonization initiative implemented by the University of Toronto. We offer a living lab ecosystem where new technology, services, and policies can be tested in a real-world context. Our team of experts includes researchers from various departments across the campus, like civil and mineral engineering, arts and sciences, public health. So basically, our mission is to accelerate the transfer of transport decarbonization research and innovation into an actionable knowledge. So that's who we are. We also have two co-sponsors for this seminar series. I would like to introduce them as well. So first, we have Mobility Network. It is the new institutional strategic initiative at the University of Toronto, jointly sponsored by University of Toronto's Transportation Research Institute and School of Cities. It is organized in overlapping knowledge clusters that addresses the global challenges in a time of disruptive change. And I would like to thank them for all the support. And next, we have the Climate Positive Energy Initiative sponsoring us as well. Climate Positive Energy Initiative is the University of Toronto Center for Interdisciplinary Clean Energy Research. There are about over 100 faculty members from 3 main campuses joined CPE with the mission to help achieve the 2050 net zero emissions through collaboration. So I will also share the links to all the websites of these initiatives in the chat. Please feel free to go check us out, like what we do and everything. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Sham. And so with this, I'm going to start introducing our first speaker today, Dr. Mark Newhouse. And Mark is the Director of Urban Planning, Environment and Health Initiative at ISG Global in Spain. He's a world-recognized expert in exposure assessment, in epidemiology. He's one of the most cited scientists in the world. And you may recognize him from a lot of very large-scale EU studies with amazing acronyms like TAPAS and PASTA and the ESCAPE study, which I will not transcribe here. But I think a lot of you already know Mark by reputation, has read his papers. And so Mark is going to start us off today talking about car-free cities as a pathway to healthy urban livings. And clearly, the gold standard for decarbonization is just not having cars. And so we'll look forward to your presentation, Mark, and then please type your questions in the chat. Thank you. You're on mute.
Yes, that's what I thought. I put my presentation up already and then I couldn't hear myself. Now you can hear me, no?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on my favorite topic. As what you said, I would say more towards car-free cities for healthy living, because we have a long way to go, and perhaps that's what we're aiming for. But I think there are also models in between, and that's also I would like to highlight. And now my presentation is not going forward. Sorry about it. Something happened here. As we probably all know, how we design a city, I'll focus mainly on cities, how we design a focus depends how people get around, how this leads to environmental exposures and lifestyle exposures, and then leads to morbidity and mortality. So for example, if we invest in the design a city for cars, we're going to get a lot of people using cars. That produces air pollution, produces noise. Cars take up a lot of space, so you get this with a lot of asphalt, so you get this heat island effects from the temperature increases which you have. You get also more stress. Car drivers are generally more stressed, they have less social contact, and particularly they have less physical activity. So they tend to be less healthy, suffer of diseases, and have more premature mortality. On the other side, if you design a city and invest in, say, active transportation like cycling, you get more people to cycle, what leads to less air pollution, less noise, they take up less space, so you don't have this kind of asphalt problem for the heat islands. Also, less stress, they have more social contacts, and particularly also more physical activity that leads to less disease, generally healthy people, and a longer life expectancy. In the terms here, also what we're looking at also leads to much less CO2 emissions when you use the bicycle instead of the car. We did a health impact assessment in Barcelona. Barcelona is a great city. I live here, but like many cities, Barcelona is car dominated. Cars, even though they're only 1 out of 4 trips are by cars, they take up 60% of the public space, as in roads and parking space. And also they lead to higher air pollution, more noise, less space for green space, the heat island effects, and also much less physical activity. And we estimated that around 3,000 premature deaths per year are due to suboptimal urban planning in Barcelona. That's about 20% of the total number of deaths. And probably this is a bit on the higher side, which you see in many cities, but many cities have exactly the same problem, this car domination that's what we see, and that leads to all these problems, including health problems and also higher CO2 emissions. So here in Barcelona, they've been thinking, what can we do? And they introduced this new urban model, the so-called Barcelona superblock. This is an idea where what you see on the left side is what we currently have is a grid system of cars going up and down, left and right. Also, we have a lot of motorbikes, you see them. In this case, for a superblock, the idea is to in a block of 9 to cut the junctions, only allow an active transportation, and then push the cars out a little bit, and the motorbikes try to reduce them, and in this way introduce an environment that is much more for people rather than for cars. We did a health impact assessment where we tried to estimate, if you introduce 500 superblocks in Barcelona, how many deaths could you prevent? And we estimated that we could prevent almost 700 premature deaths each year if we would introduce them. Now, unfortunately, there are not so many superblocks that have been introduced so far. This is the second one, is the Barcelona superblock in Sant Antoni, which you can see on the top of the photo what was before, where you saw a normal street with cars, and at the bottom what it looked afterwards. Currently, there's 30 more superblocks on the way. And that's what I said to you before, when we did kind of the modeling to see what are the effects of the superblocks, we estimated that if you introduce use the 500 superblocks, it would lead to an overall reduction in car use, but also related to that, a reduction in nitrogen dioxide by about 25%, reduction in noise, increase in green space, because particularly for where the cars are taken out, that want to put in more green space, a reduction of surface temperature. Unfortunately, we didn't estimate a reduction in, say, CO2 emissions, but probably that as a reduction in car, as there is a reduction in car use, you will also reduce the CO2. As what I said, we estimated that we could prevent almost 700 deaths in Barcelona if they're all being introduced. And the largest proportion actually comes from the reduction in nitrogen dioxide. We have still fairly high levels here because of the high traffic density. So reducing this air pollution levels will reduce it quite a lot. This is then followed by noise, reduction in heat, increase in green spaces. And we didn't estimate so many benefits of physical activity because we didn't know how people would change the behavior in physical activity. So we didn't have any data for that. So we didn't include in the model, but probably the benefits will be much greater. So this is changing more a physical change of the environment. In Paris, they do it slightly different, I think, where they don't specifically look at a physical environment, but a change in behavior, and they're trying to introduce the 15-minute city. I think this got much more attention than the superblock in Barcelona, and it's very exciting. But the idea for the 15-minute city is that all people's destinations, whether it's cultural events, schools, shops, work, whatever you can think of, would be within a 15-minute walk or cycling ride of their house. In that way, then they don't have to use motorized vehicles, like cars, and they get more physical activity, walking and cycling. I mean, I haven't got any data on this yet for how this would work out in practice, what would be the benefits towards health. We're doing some work on that. I've got some PhD students working on it. But again, I mean, I think it's a very nice model and it's been picked up by many cities. And I think it's nice to aspire to. And then as what I said before, I mean, ideally you go to a completely car-free city. Hamburg said they're going to be car-free by 2034. That got a lot of publicity a few years ago. This was done not for health, but for sustainability issues. Now, I don't know how exactly the plan works or if it's going to go ahead, because when I talk to people in Hamburg, many people don't know about it. But I think it's still the plan that in particular the city center becomes car-free. There's, of course, as many advantages. I mean, because you reduce the air pollution, the noise, you have much more space for green space, less heat out effects, you have more physical activity, less CO2. A while ago, I wrote an article about this with a colleague. It's already 5-6 years old, but I think it introduces all the potential benefits that we actually could get. A neighborhood that's actually already car-free, that's Vauban in Freiburg. And if you go to Freiburg by any chance in the next few years, please visit Vauban. It's a wonderful neighborhood. No cars allowed within the neighborhood, a lot of green space, sustainable housing. The only disadvantage is that everyone wants to live there, of course, and the prices are relatively high. Now, to make these changes is not so easy, and I think perhaps we need to think about for how we can reduce the health burden related to our current traffic and also the CO2 emissions. And perhaps that's maybe easier to introduce 30 kilometer per hour limits within the city, within all the city boundaries, to reduce the risk for accidents and also the reduction of emissions from air pollution, CO2, etc., and to make a much calmer city. Of course, it's not only good to set these limits, but also to enforce them. Many cities in Europe already introduced 30 kilometer per hour limits in many of the roads in the cities, but they don't enforce them. And it would be nice to do this more. So far, and I think we hear it later from Norway, the electric car has been very much promoted as the solution for lowering carbon emissions, but I don't think it's the solution, to be honest. I mean, a car is still a car. I mean, it's of course promoted by car manufacturers because it doesn't make much of a difference if you sell a fossil fuel car or an electric car, you sell something. But you know, the car still takes up a lot of space that we can use in a much better way. And still people don't get physical activity, and also there are still some air pollution emissions from tires and brakes, and there is still some noise from the tires. So I mean, it's not the perfect solution, I think. Therefore, particularly within cities, we should be thinking about other modes of transport, like the bicycle, for example. Many of the cars make trips of less than 5 kilometers. This could be easily replaced by cycling. One city that I in particular like, where do a lot of work, is Utrecht in the Netherlands. I was there last month quite a few times. It's a wonderful city to be. They're very progressive, many people cycling and not so many cars. I mean, if you want to experience a nice city, go to visit Utrecht. I suggest you visit it in the summer when the weather is nice, because it can be a bit more tricky in the winter. We did a study in 167 European cities with where 75 million people lived, to see what would happen if you would reduce car driving and increase cycling up to 1 out of 4 modes of transport for cycling, so up to 25%. And we estimated you could prevent 10,000 premature deaths each year in these cities if people would cycle more, or more people would be cycling. It's of course not the transport only, it's also, as what I said, the creating space for green space, what we know all is very important. We know that people living in green space live longer, have have fewer mental health problems, less heart disease and this kind of things. And we estimated recently in 1,000 cities in Europe that 60% of the population don't have enough access to green space as recommended by the World Health Organization. And if we would increase the green space in these cities, that we could prevent 43,000 deaths each year in the cities. So for me, this would mean, you know, taking away the asphalt that we have for the cars and putting in more trees, what would have many benefits. Can it be done? I think yes. I mean, here we see some examples. This was Seoul, where they took the motorway away on the left side and put in some green and blue, smaller road, much nicer environment to be in. This is the Alderhay Hospital in Liverpool. On the left side, you can see the old hospital with a park next to it. This is a children's hospital. They asked the children, what would you like? They said, the children, we want more park space. So they built a new hospital where the old park was on the ground to a large extent, green space on top, and the old hospital became a park. So a much better use of the space. This is one of my favorite streets in Barcelona. It's Rambla de Poblenou. If you ever come to Barcelona, please go. I think this is what you see. This is a street where people walk, the cycling lanes on the side. We have trees to cover against the heat, and it's a wonderful environment to be. There's a mix of people living and shops, and I think this is some of the streets that we should see as the future. People can come still in by car to park their car if they live there, but you don't see much through traffic going through it. Of course, if we want to make changes, we need to all work together. I come from a public health background. I can provide advice, what would be healthier options or better options for health, but I can't make the changes. So that's why I would like to work with urban planners, transport planners, but also, for example, with the education sector. Too many kids are being taken to school by car, while they should be actually walking or cycling or use public transport to get there. So I think we need all the worst sectors to come together to look for solutions. If you want to read a little bit more about it, I recently published a couple of papers on the topic, and also a little book you can get from Amazon, particularly related to COVID-19, because during the COVID-19 lockdowns, we saw actually how much we could improve cities. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions later on or get any comments. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mark. Lots of very, very thought-provoking. I actually really like, and we'll leave questions to the end, but I really like how you've established that connection that we always think about, you know, cars as a driver to climate change through the emissions of greenhouse gases, but roads promote urban heat island effect, which we want to try and reduce as a climate adaptation approach, because we are, you know, our inner city cores are experiencing, you know, heat waves and higher temperatures, right? And we often sort of really miss that connection.
Yeah, it's particularly an issue here in Barcelona, and we're in the middle of a heat wave of about 2 months. And I guess it's less so in Toronto, but certainly here it's an issue where we have way too much asphalt, concrete, etc., lying around that should be greened.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll keep typing your questions in the chat. My next speaker is Peter Hogneland. And Peter, now you have a big challenge, because we started by saying, well, we got to live, you know, we got to build cities that are car-free. But we, of course, all agree that, you know, electrification, decarbonization cannot occur without some form of electrification for serving some specific purposes. So I'm going to introduce Peter, and I'll let you go through your presentation. Peter, the Assistant Secretary General of the Norwegian Electric Vehicle Association, that represents EV owners across Norway, liaising with policymakers, the electric car industry, and other organizations. And I know we have participants here from NGOs and from electric vehicle associations in Canada who are looking forward to your talk, Peter. So whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share your slides.
Yeah, thank you very much for a kind introduction, and good morning and afternoon from Oslo. I will present the Norwegian EV market from a user perspective. I work at the Norwegian EV Association, and as was said, we represent EV owners in Norway. We have over 120,000 members, mostly private EV owners in Norway, and currently over 50 employees based here in Oslo. And our goal is to electrify transport as fast as possible. And I totally agree, and we can discuss this more with Mark and the former speaker on that. We have to also see the combination of bicycling, walking, public transport, especially in the cities. I'm myself is an eager electric biker, using that every day and love it. And that has also been a big revolution in Oslo, but in other places where there's too long distances and so on, that's not enough. So I will focus my presentation on electric cars, but I'm happy to also discuss city policies and biking in the panel afterwards. So just a quick brief on the Norwegian EV market. As you see here in the graph, we have gone from almost 0% market share in 2009 to 78% today in just over 10 years. It's a remarkable development. And at the same time, the plug-in hybrid has been stabilized and now going down because the zero-emission electric vehicles take over most of the market. And as you might know, Norway has a very ambitious goal. The government and parliament has said that all new cars sold by 2025 should be zero-emission electric vehicles or zero-emission vehicles, not including plug-in hybrids. So far this year, we have passed 500,000 electric vehicles in Norway and 180,000 plug-in hybrids. And that's not that many, and Norway is a small country, but but still, compared to the total fleet of cars, it's about 18% for passenger cars. For bigger cars and trucks and buses, we still have a very long way to go. So why are Norwegian market world leading in the market share for passenger cars at least? And it's the policy. We have had electric or incentives for electric cars for a very long time, and the market has been booming when the products came. In the beginning, we didn't have that many electric cars to choose from, but now it's really booming, and that's because we make electric cars competitive compared to petrol and diesel cars. So if you're going to buy a petrol car in Norway today, it's going to be very expensive because we have high CO2 taxes on purchasing cars. But for zero emission cars, the tax is zero. So that's why it's, when you're going to buy it, it's competitive, very competitive price. And we also have some incentives for driving and owning the car, like toll roads is cheaper. Before it was free, now it's cheaper at least. So we're starting to remove some of the incentives with the market development, but still they are. The point is that it should always be competitive compared to petrol and diesel cars. And other incentives that we have still, maybe not that strong as in the beginning, but still very strong incentives. Representing the EV owners, so I will present a bit about their views and experience with electric cars. Every year we do a survey among our members. Last year we had over 15,000 respondents. We asked them where they live, why they choose their EV, how they use it, how they charge, and so on. So I'm just going to present a few results from last year's survey. So we see a development that from the start, the electric car was the second car in the household. They used it for the commuting, and for longer trips, the range and the car was not good enough. So most of them, the pioneers of the electric car in ownerships was commuters with a short driving distance, and they had a second car for the longer trips. But now we see that more and more are 100% EV households. In Norway, of course, it's not very densely populated, so most people have their own parking, and a big majority of the people in Norway with EVs charge at home on a daily basis. And that's really easy to do. You just plug in the afternoon, and the next morning you have a full battery. And that makes them very happy about their choice of trying out this new technology that EVs are. But also a lot of them now use fast charging because when they're going on longer trips, vacation, business trips, they might have to also charge on the way. So 80% uses fast charging, but not very often. The majority uses fast charging less than monthly or very seldom, not on a daily basis for most people, because they charge at home. That's cheaper, more convenient. But to replace all driving needs, also especially the longer trips, we need a public network of fast chargers. So the Norwegian government had a tender many years ago where we covered all the main roads in Norway every 50 kilometers with 2 fast chargers on the main roads, and most of it was finished by 2017, but not in the furthermost north of Norway, above the Arctic Circle in Finnmark. But now the recent years, they also cover the northernmost country, and we see also a 50% market share, even in the far north of Norway. So now we build bigger station. This is a Tesla station in Norway. It's not just 2 fast chargers every location. It's a lot more. And we also see energy stations, that traditional petrol stations normally also have fast chargers now in Norway. And the new one they built, this one is an example where you drive into the station on the left and you start seeing the fast chargers, and the petrol pumps are put in the back, and they also have solar panels on the roof and battery storage connected to the station. This is also another one, a big location, and they also have room for more. There's chargers all around the station. And even with a lot of high market share and sales of EVs, they also build a lot of fast chargers. We just passed 5,000 fast chargers, and the amount of fast electric cars that has to share on each fast charger is going down. So that's a good development. But still, people experience charging queues in Norway, especially on weekends and vacations. Now in July, when we had our summer vacations, a lot of people were driving in Norway and all, but also abroad. And in some locations, we saw that there still is queuing. So we have to build a lot more. We estimate that we should almost double the amount of fast chargers by 2025, when the market is supposed to, or the goal is that all new cars will be fully electric. So that was just a fast background from Norway, and I'm happy to discuss more in the panel. And if you want to see it for yourself, visiting Norway, you could come to Oslo in May when we have the Nordic EV Summit. It's also much more pleasant climate then, or weather than now. So please join us at the Nordic EV Summit next year.
Thanks a lot, Peter. And I see that there's a few questions for you in the chat, but we'll leave them to the panel. That's just mind-blowing, especially just the gradients on these curves. Yeah, they're always showing just the slopes. I just, it's hard for me to believe. I think I'm going to challenge you later on during the panel on and maybe Askild will touch upon that because he's the economist on this panel. How does the economics work? No taxes on EVs, and yet all this investment in chargers. Who's paying for this, and where is this coming from? And so I think we're all very interested to hear more about it. With this, I'm going to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Askild Halse, who is a chief research economist at the Institute of Transport Economics in Norway. He has done a lot of work on choice, on behavior, on travel behavior, but primarily also on car taxation and vehicle electrification policies. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say, Askild. Thank you. Yeah, we can see your slides on our end.
Yeah, I just had to find the unmute button. Yes, so thank you, Marianne. Thanks a lot for having me, and good morning, everyone. So I will talk a bit about this from the research side, particularly then going into some recent research findings that we have based on registered data in Norway. So as we all agree, the climate policy requires rapid reductions in carbon emissions from transport, and knowledge about the demographics of EV ownership is important to know to say something about the market potential of these vehicles. And as Norway is quite far ahead of almost other countries, as Petter just showed us, we can be like a crystal ball for other countries. Like the patterns that we see here might be similar to what you would see in other countries in a few years. Luckily for us researchers, Norway is not just world leading on electric vehicles, but Norway and the Scandinavian countries also have very good access to so-called microdata from administrative registers that's being used for research. And that's something that has been used quite a lot in like labor market research, health economics, economics of education, and so forth. It hasn't really been used that much in transport research so far. So that's something that we try to change. I will talk mainly about this paper that we published last year on the characteristics of electric vehicle owners in Norway, which is also joint with Erik Feigenbaum, who was the original speaker of this session. And here we are. It's what we economists like to talk about as a descriptive paper. So we mainly like describe the patterns that we can see in terms of characteristics of the EV owners and how this changes over time as well. But I will also talk a bit about this other paper where we go more to the policy side, where we look at the effects of some key of these incentives that Petter mentioned, how that affects car ownership. So Petter already showed you some new figures, so I don't have to spend time on mine, which are slightly older. I just have to mention that the results that I will show now, they are from data that go up till 2017. So obviously quite a lot has changed since then, but still in terms compared to other countries, what we study is still what we could call a mature EV market. And what we focus on then is the battery electric vehicles, the real deal. We don't focus on the plug-in hybrids. So what we do in this paper is that we distinguish households by their car ownership. So we have households that don't have a car, households that have only one conventional car, households that have 2 or more conventional cars, households that have 1 electric vehicle, and households that have 2 cars with at least one of them being electric. And as Petter mentioned, in this period, most households that had electric vehicles, they had another vehicle in addition. And what we can see is that among the households that have electric vehicles, they tend to be quite a lot younger than the other households. These are typically young people, also typically people with young children. We can also see that they tend to have significantly higher education. We can also see that they tend to live in urban areas and so far, or close to urban areas. And when we combined all these different characteristics in the same model, we can sort of like identify the typical electric vehicle owning household. So that would be a young couple with children living at home, close to a major city. They have a detached house so they can charge at home, higher education, and also that they tend to be exposed to these incentives on their trip to work that make it very profitable to have an EV. And when if you tick all these boxes at the same time, you have a probability of owning an EV of 32%. So in 2017, that's quite a high number. While if you untick most of these boxes, so we can characterize the typical non-BEV household. That would be a couple quite a lot older, not without children living at home, and so forth. And then you get the probability of only 2%. So what we see here is that we can actually explain quite a lot of the variation in EV ownership only based on observed characteristics from this register data. And one characteristic that we are particularly concerned about is income, of course. There's a lot of attention in public debate given to this, whether EVs are only for rich people. And we do find, as expected, that EV owners tend to have high income. But what we're interested in seeing is whether this is a characteristic of EV owners in particular, or whether it also applies to owners of new cars more generally. So, and then it makes a huge difference whether we look at all cars or new cars. So this is for all cars, and we see that particularly in the smaller car segment, there's a big difference between EV owners and other car owners. So this on the horizontal axis here, you have different income segment, and you see that the non-EVs, they tend to be concentrated among the middle income segments, while EV ownership is increasing with income. And there's also a bit of difference in the larger car segment, that there's a different shape to this curve. But if we only focus on the new cars, it looks much more similar for EV owners and other car owners. So both EV ownership and also ownership of other new cars increases steeply with income. So it's not just that rich people are buying EVs, rich people are buying new cars in general, also conventional cars. And when we also take into account the value of the car, the same picture becomes even a bit clearer, that people that buy new and expensive cars tend to be people that have high income, as expected. So the pattern that we observe is driven by the fact that in this period, all the EVs are typically new cars, and therefore they are bought by the kind of people that typically buy new cars, and that would be people with high income. But as in the coming years, of course, this will probably change quite a lot, because the market, there will also be a market for used EVs. And they will then be available to also other income segments to a larger degree. And that's, luckily, we just got a new project that will study the transition of the car fleet in more detail. So then we will focus particularly on the used car market. So that's for this paper, and then I will talk just briefly about the other paper, and that's something that maybe speaks a bit more to Petter's presentation and also to Mark's, I think, where we look at the effect of these policies. And we have studied then the effect of road tolls and bus lanes on the trip to work. And the reason why we use the commuting trip is that we have this registered data, so we can actually identify which neighborhood people live and where they work, and then we can look at differences in incentives on the work trip for very similar people. And when we do this, we find that yes, there is a very strong effect of road tolls and bus lanes on the probability of owning an EV. So that's the good news. But what we also see is that it seems to be that at least in this period that we look at, when EVs had full exemption from road tolls, it seems that this has led to higher car ownership. So if you look at the red, now the yellow or gold results at the end here, you see that in the period before EVs were introduced, we see that road tolls, it actually caused some people to not buy cars, not have cars at all. But as EVs were introduced in combination with this road toll exemption, this effect has largely vanished. So there, as we would expect, there does seem to be a trade-off between stimulating EV adoption and limiting car traffic and the negative effects of this in urban areas. And in Norway, we have quite ambitious targets for limiting car traffic. We have this so-called zero growth target for car traffic in urban areas, and then you would have to look at how to fine-tune these policies not to violate that target. So that's it from me. I think if you're interested in more of this research, it's all available online, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me or write in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Askiel, very much, and thank you for this, for closing in such an interesting way, kind of showing us the impact of out-of-pocket costs, right? Like road toll and parking that do influence usage, right? As opposed to, you know, subsidies for vehicle sales that could influence ownership, but ownership also influences usage. And our next speaker, I hope she'll touch upon all of this. I know Aruna has done her fair share of studying, you know, ownership, but also mode choice and travel behavior. And she's going to close us off, you know, on the topic of, well, where are these trends going? Are people going to rely less or more on vehicles? What are some of, you know, the trends that are shaping cities over the next decades? Dr. Aruna Sivakumar is the director of the Urban Systems Lab at Imperial College in London. She leads a large number of smart city and systems modeling initiatives. She's an international expert in activity-based microsimulation model of urban resource demands. And so without further ado, whenever you're ready, Aruna. We can see your slides.
Yes, I just realized I couldn't find the unmute button. Anyway, thank you so much, Marianne. What I realized as I was listening to all these great presentations, thanks first of all for inviting me, but what I realized as I was listening to all of these presentations is that mine is not as focused as some of these are, partly because Marianne presented to me a very difficult question, and she said, talk about how transportation options will evolve over time and how they will be influenced by societal trends. And that's a big question. And that's a question that I think most of us the world over are grappling with. And I gave it a bit of thought, and I tried to summarize where actually a lot of other people have been doing great work in trying to identify future scenarios. And that's why I've titled the talk Future of Mobility, because there have been so many future of mobility studies around the world in different countries. And I'm not going to try to summarize all of those here. But starting with that, a presentation along those lines, I move on to a few different projects that I'm working on. And as Marianne said, a lot of projects I work on touch on the many topics we've talked about here. And I didn't want to dwell on all of them. So I've tried to identify 3 or 4 of those that I'll briefly talk about. So it's a bit scattered in that sense, but I welcome questions both in the panel and offline, as if anyone's interested. So just a couple of quick slides as background, so you know where I'm coming from. I lead a research group called the Urban Systems Lab, and our expertise is basically in developing descriptive and predictive models. So the descriptive models try to understand human activity patterns in terms of mobility, time use, energy use, adoption of new technologies or services, travel behavior, but also develop predictive models that can then feed into planning tools, mostly strategic planning, but also some degree of operational planning. And in this process, I work with a lot of different kinds of data. We collect our own data of behavioral responses to road user charging. That's one of the most exciting projects I'm doing right now, but I'm not going to talk about it because I don't have ready results to talk about. I've got some data that we've collected on EV technologies, such as vehicle to grid and EV adoption and so on. So we deal in data collection, both qualitative and quantitative, including stated choice experiments. Also deal with data from pervasive sensing technologies, work with data fusion, both sensor data fusion as well as other more traditional forms of data sets. So this is sort of very much a data intensive, modeling intensive, and yet drawing on the expertise of many others and collecting our own data, and drawing on sociological theories and developing these models is kind of where my research group comes from. And a sample of projects we work on, including work on electric and shared mobility. So a variety of projects that look at electric cars, car clubs, electric car clubs, electric bikes and bike sharing, electric cargo bikes. I'll mention that briefly in one of the slides today. But also looking at how charging patterns will vary for a country like the UK, trying to understand where people will need charging and how much charging. Cities like London, and in fact, many other cities that are increasingly more dense, we do not have the kind of freedom of parking spots that was mentioned previously in Norway. So the charging question and the public infrastructure question is a serious problem. So we develop models to help support the planning of that. But equally, we're looking at things like autonomous vehicles. So there's so much work on developing autonomous vehicle technology, infrastructure, design, and so on, but so little about doing it in collaboration with user needs. And by user needs, I don't mean the people who are using the autonomous vehicles, but other road users. And there's very little. There's research that looks at how road users interact with autonomous vehicles, but very little that feeds back that research into the design process of autonomous vehicles or of infrastructure that will allow these autonomous vehicles to operate. And that is something that really bothers me, because I think that if we let this go, then we're heading towards a world where you freely see autonomous vehicles moving around, which are not designed for other road users to interact with appropriately, which can be quite disastrous. So these are the kind of things that bother me, and therefore the kind of research we do tends to focus on this. So far, I've mentioned mostly passenger mobility, but equally we look at fleet electrification. In fact, a lot of my electric vehicle related research in recent times has been fleet related, looking at what are the barriers for public sector bodies, private sector, etc., to fully electrify their fleets, how they might be influenced by technology such as vehicle to grid. Does that then encourage the business case from their perspective and the return on investment and so on? So there's all of that, but equally also looking at the impacts of all of these on energy and building systems. So that's briefly background. Now, talking about trends, to try to answer at least Marianne's question, we live in a time when clearly there's lots of trends that were happening pre-pandemic and continue to happen I say post-pandemic, though we live in a post-pandemic world, which is not quite the same as a pre-pandemic. And these changes are significant and they impact the entire socio-technical system. So just as infrastructures become more connected, and the classic example of connected infrastructures is the electrical networks and the transport networks. But there's many more connections between the infrastructures today. But in the same way, people are connected more, not just to each other, but to that technical system, that infrastructure and technological system in many different ways. And I've borrowed a slide from gfk.com, who produce insights and infographics, which talks about invisible analytics and the role of artificial intelligence in influencing our lives and virtual reality and so on. There's data that we generate in so many different forms, all of which that link together. And of course, there are regulations about allowing them to link together, but there's also a lot of value that could be unlocked when they're linked together in terms of providing services. And it's always, I think, the flip side to it about the danger of all of this data as well. But we live in that world where there's so much connectivity. At the same time, many of the countries in Europe, North America, populations are aging, and this is a reality. And this is increasingly leading to an uncertain future, which is exacerbated and accelerated due to the pandemic in many different ways. And while all of this is happening, you also have the transport system changes. And these changes were again happening pre-pandemic, continue to happen, maybe have been modified, but nevertheless accelerated in many ways. There's electric vehicles, which we've talked about. There's connected and autonomous vehicles. There are location-based services, which have been rapidly becoming more and more on point in terms of how effective they are in supporting, providing supporting services. There's a variety of shared mobility services. There's the whole concept of mobility as a service, which in fact dates back to the 1950s or 60s, when integrated intermodal transport was a big deal. Micro-mobilities, including e-scooters and e-bikes, on-demand transit. So London had a huge on-demand transit trial that they had started just before the pandemic, which unfortunately got impacted a good bit by the pandemic. Nevertheless, is well on their agenda to plan shared mobility services, but on a larger scale. So you actually have public transport services that are on demand. Collaborative logistics, which has also been a big thing. We've been doing some collaborative work in Denmark on this. Role of drones, UAVs. So all of these have been disrupting or promising new potential in the transport system. And as people who are concerned with what the impact that mobility related changes have on people's lives, we need to analyze every one of these. So if we want to analyze the future of mobility and all of these trends, let's take, for example, look at socio-demographic changes. Just because I'm sort of leaving out all the technology out of it for the moment, there are so many things you need to consider. So just taking as an example, if you have increased older drivers, we need to be thinking of, does this mean increased traffic on roads? Because these drivers are now from a generation, a cohort that has always been very mobile. Does that mean we need to be concerned with safety considerations even more in the future than we are now? In what form? Accessibility, are things going to be equally accessible for such a mobile older generation? Driving or using public transport, as the case may be. As you have younger people whose attitudes are still not fully understood, the newer cohorts, there's the whole reference to people starting to drive later in life or perhaps driving less. But the question is this a sustained change, or is it specific to life cycles? Is it just that when they eventually get married and have children, they come back to I need a car because that's the easiest way to get my kids around kind of solution? Would they be more comfortable with sharing resources because there's a bit of a return to communal living and a greater awareness of health and well-being? There's so many unknowns in all of this. Equally, population growth, the growth in number of young adults living at home with parents, or one-person households increasing. Each of these inspires a train of thought processes which try to look at what the potential implications are. And you similarly need to analyze technological innovations, infrastructural changes, the implications of all of these for supply and demand in terms of passengers and also goods and services. And only then would I've answered Marianne's question. So I'm not going to try to do that. Instead, I will point out that there are many future of mobility studies which have tried to do just that. Now, all of these were pre-pandemic, and I think there's always a need to revisit these future of mobility studies and update roadmaps and so on. But there's so many of these. There's Trends in Britain, which tries to categorize different future scenarios. One's called Driving Ahead, and they're all somewhat self-explanatory. One's called Driving Ahead, one's called Living Local, another one's called Digital Divide. Similarly, Mobility for EU is a big EU project that tries to do a similar thing, tries to categorize potential future pathways that mobility can take. There's a future of mobility study in the UK, which inspired the title of my talk today. There's reprogramming mobility in the US. There's other AV specific, autonomous vehicle specific road mapping projects as well. And we have all of these summarized, brought together in a paper that we've just written up that's going to go to transportation journals. So I'm happy to share if anyone wants more information about these studies. But in all of these studies, they look at the future of mobility in terms of GDP scenarios, population growth scenarios, AV adoption, role of shared resources, and so on, including consumer attitudes and trends, government policies, etc. And as I said, I'm not going to try to summarize all of that, but I'm going to move from that summary to a few projects that I've worked on recently that have all in some way or the other tried to target the many components of that future of mobility. And most of these projects are focused on either trialing out some of these what are called smart city initiatives, collecting data, trying to figure out how best to monitor these trials. Something we found over and over again is trials could be monitored. And by monitored, I mean you could you could actually plumb the data collection from trials much more than they are at the moment. And that was my experience with this particular project that's in front of you at the moment. Sharing Cities was a fascinating 5-year-long project that I was involved with that ended in 2021, in December 2021. And there were 3 big cities, London, Lisbon, and Madrid, with smart city initiatives being implemented in all these 3 cities. These included citizen engagement, so some sort of a digital platform where service providers operate with citizens, or interact with citizens, engage with citizens, and try to inspire marketplaces, a social marketplace where citizens are incentivized to engage in more desirable, sustainable lifestyles, be that more active walking and cycling, or more recycling, reducing rubbish, whatever it might be. So that was citizen engagement policies. We had some buildings related policies. We had a bunch of mobility related policies, including electric vehicle based car sharing systems, e-bike sharing systems, charging points for electric vehicles, including what are called smart lampposts, smart parking systems, e-logistics such as e-cargo bikes. So all of these were trialed out, and I have in front of you a summary of some of those trials, which I'm not going to dwell on at the moment. And in all of these, we designed a monitoring plan, data collection before, during, and after these measures, analyzed the impacts of these measures within the trials, looked at whether that could be replicated and scaled up, what sort of lessons we could learn from this, and lots of valuable knowledge, I guess, gained from these trials that we've then summarized in a few playbooks and more that's available from the researchers. So that was one project. And as I mentioned, the key mobility initiatives, although we did data monitoring for all the initiatives, the key mobility initiatives were basically e-bike loan schemes, lamppost chargers, e-cargo bikes, an electric vehicle fleet for the municipal fleet, as well as car sharing more widely. Then moving on, so that was very much about trials and data, and I have a few projects that are related to that. But many other research projects tend to be very much about developing modeling tools that can then be used for strategic planning, tools that are sensitive to the kind of scenarios that we are envisioning for the future. Tools that are not only sensitive to income and age and gender and all of that, but are also sensitive to how people react to new technologies, are sensitive to the infrastructure behind those new technologies, sensitive to virtual versus digital versus physical ways of doing things. So these are all the facts, that the characteristics underlying the models that we try to develop, so that we can then produce model systems that can be used to analyze what-if scenarios more effectively for the future. So this is an example, again, an activity-based mobility and energy demand model that looks at actual in-home versus out-of-home trade-offs. So trade-off between working from home and working from work, as well as working while you're on the go, and also equally shopping online and shopping in store. So all of the different virtual equivalents of the physical activities are actually part of the activity generation and scheduling model system for this demand model that we've been developing for at the moment for London. And similarly, Marianne's mentioned this a couple of times. I have a lot of work, which I'm only summarizing here, on the future of car ownership models. There are two aspects in particular that I'm focused on. One is the dynamics. The fact is preferences change. There are cohort impacts, there are life cycle impacts, and yet in the UK, the national car ownership model is a cross-sectional model. And I think that we've demonstrated with a PhD student, because this was a long piece of research, that actually with a dynamic model, you get completely different predictions or forecasts for the future. Not completely different, but a significant error is reduced when you forecast into the future than when you use cross-sectional static models. So there's a thread of work on more dynamic models of car ownership. There's another thread of work which is basically looking at car ownership as part of a mobility portfolio. If you're looking at a future where you have more shared resources where you have ride-hailing systems, e-mobility, e-scooters and e-bikes and so on, then car ownership becomes part of a mobility portfolio. And this is important not just from a behavioral perspective, because that's how people consider car ownership, but also from a policy perspective. If we want a city that's an e-bike city, as Professor Kai Axhausen talks about, then we need to know, how will the e-bike within the mobility portfolio, how can it be incentivized to be a key part of an individual or a household's mobility portfolio? And so I've got a PhD student who's looking at car ownership as part of the mobility portfolio. We've been working on qualitative data collection, and now we're designing a more quantitative survey in order to be able to model this mobility portfolio. We also look at the effect of social influence and choice behavior, how to quantify social influence. Do others' attitudes influence the individual's choice directly? Is it possible to quantify these attitudes in a non-subjective manner, which is the biggest question? And does it ultimately improve the model fit of travel demand models? How do we use these models then to actually make a difference to policy, etc.? So there's a few electric vehicle and bike sharing case studies, and I've only presented here a link to the most recent paper. And last, I'll just stop with this, which is trying to point out that ultimately mobility provision is about ensuring accessibility. And the accessibility framework has been around for a long time, a very long time. However, it's clearly time to update that framework in many different ways. The obvious way is that there's a lot more data that's available today that can inform the accessibility framework. But the other thing that I'm very keen to do is that the population, people, the road users, the public transport and the transport system users are far more aware of health implications, of the quality of life in terms of stress during travel, and so on. So in that sense, focusing on efficient public transport or efficient transport systems is no longer sufficient. It also needs to be about the quality of the transport service that is provided. Is it healthy? Is it stress-free? Is it safe? And unless our accessibility metrics, which are used for planning, account for these, we're never going to provide what the population of the future wants. And so on this project, this is called a Pathways to Healthy and Equitable Cities, we're looking exactly at that, at enhancing that accessibility metric to account for safety, air quality, etc. So I'll stop with that and hand back to Marianne.
Wow, that's thank you very much, Aruna. Lots of amazing ideas, and I love how you wrapped it up with this last slide, because that gets us talking about a lot of things. I do realize we've only have 15 minutes left to our scheduled session. Lots of questions in the Q&A, which I won't have a chance to get to all of them. So I encourage all of you speakers to go ahead and type your answers as they come along. That's fine. I think one question I have for all of you, and I'd like all of you to give me your perspective on, I want to raise the question of affordability. I think one thing that was, clear across all the presentations, and Mark, you even started with that, car-free cities are great, but car-free cities are expensive cities, right? And Askil and Peter, you've talked about EV ownership. We've talked about incentives, and Askil, I certainly want to hear the economist perspective on incentivizing or disincentivizing. But we've pretty much established that, if you're rich, you can afford quality mobility, whether it means owning a new car, whether it means owning an EV, or whether it means living in a car-free city where you can afford to get to wherever you want within 15 minutes and on a bike. And if you are living at the poverty line, you are mobility poor. You either have no car or you live in an area with very poor public transit and you can't afford to live in the central inner city core. So maybe, your perspective on all of these, and I'll start perhaps with our first speaker today, Mark, and then go to Peter, Askil, and Aruna.
Yes, it's true. If you look at the car-free development, like in Vauban, it's expensive because it's so attractive and there are so few around. I mean, that's always what we have in economics: the scarcity of goods, what people want to have. I mean, So in a way, my response would be we need to plan more of these car-free developments, because that's where people want to live. I mean, I think, I mean, also what I hear here is a lot about transport planning, but I think we should start off also with urban planning, and we just take it for granted that people need to move around, but because of the current urban planning, people need to move around long distances, and I think we need to reduce these to start with, and rethink how we do our urban planning, and then to reduce the time to travel, reduce the cost to travel. That may actually help as well. So far, yes, people that are poor end up in places where they don't have access to transport, where there are many other things that the richer people can enjoy. And that's one of the big problems we have. Here in Barcelona, they try to address it by including social housing in new developments, so that at least 30% of housing in new development needs to be for social housing, so that also poorer people actually can enjoy nicer neighborhoods.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. Always, yeah, taking us back to the issue of urban planning. I think in transportation, we clearly understand that the connection between land use and transportation is very big. It's always easier to think about, yeah, how to reduce the number of cars on the road and renew and electrify the ones that are still are, as opposed to rethinking how do we change, you know, distances on the road. I think it's a simple question that we've always been asked, but from a policy point of view, I don't see us at a policy level really starting with that question, and it's a very, very interesting one for sure. Peter.
Yeah, I think it's a big problem for climate policy and environmental policy measures in general, that they're expected to solve all problems at once. So you need to solve the CO2 emissions, the local pollution, the space restrictions in cities, and also equity issues. And that's not how you can't do that. And then you end up with nothing because it's too hard. All new technology, they are expensive in the beginning. You have flat screens, you have solar panels. It's for the rich in the beginning, and hopefully, as Askild mentioned, and we see that in Norway, that used cars, used EVs are cheaper now, also more available for also lower income families. And of course, in Norway, normally the electricity is also much cheaper, and electric cars are also more energy efficient, so it can also be cheaper. And of course, you have to combine this with the city policies, like restrictions on parking, or restrictions with toll roads, or car-free cities. But we need a lot of measures, because the environmental issues, and especially the climate issue, is now we don't have time to like find the perfect solution. We just have to do a lot of at the same time and try to solve different problems with different measures.
Yeah, thanks. I've always wrestled with this idea, is we are now in a state of climate urgency, right? And we need to move fast, and we need to reduce carbon emissions really fast. And while doing so, the easiest thing is to rely on technology, because technology is developing way faster than even policy and academia is able to absorb and understand, right? And so we're sort of, again, stuck in this situation where we can't, as societies, afford in strategic level decision making, right, that allow us to engage in different scenarios. We have to act fast, and that's the big challenge, is that while doing so, you know, there might end up being also unintended consequences of climate mitigation. Askild.
Yes, so I also think this is a very important issue. I mean, obviously, environmental taxes, restrictive policies against cars, and so forth, they hurt people with low income more than people with high income. And with EVs, this is maybe even amplified. as those with high income, they can adapt by buying an EV. We actually see that in our results as well, that the road tolls on the commuting trip, it causes low income people to reduce their car ownership, but high income people to buy EVs instead. So it's obviously an important issue, but I think we're demanding too much if we think that these issues of inequality in transport are to be solved within the transport system or in urban planning or in environmental policy alone. I think it's much better to solve issues of economic inequality by tackling economic inequality directly by active redistributional policies that give more resources to the low income people. Because if you try to help the low income people by giving them cheap gasoline or subsidies that are particularly for them for EVs or things like that, then you're making the choices for them, and not all people with low income need to have a car. Maybe they can choose themselves instead. So instead of trying to fine-tune these transport policies to be more equitable, we should rather give the low-income people the economic resources to be able to make these choices for themselves, I think.
Thank you, Aruna.
Yeah, so again, I don't have answers. Just a brief comment on your thought, Marianne, about strategic planning and the fact that we perhaps don't have the time for it. I think the problem is that you need an accelerated approach to strategic planning rather than the lack of it, because I find that when we analyze, I can provide a couple of examples as evidence of exactly what you're talking about. One is we recently conducted a before and after data collection effort in Birmingham, where they had a clean air zone implemented. And the idea was that vehicles below a certain level wouldn't be allowed within the clean air zone. And we found from an analysis of that data that actually higher income individuals hardly changed their behavior in terms of driving into the clean air zone. And the people who are affected most are those who are in the lower income group who reduced the number of trips into the clean air zone. Now, the question then becomes, how does this affect them? Do they have opportunities that are only available in the clean air zone that affects them? And these are all questions that need to be further explored to see exactly what those impacts are. But clearly, that was something that was, maybe if somebody had asked me that question, I'd have said, yes, we would anticipate that. And that's exactly what we see. But then, are we prepared to then look at what are the implications of the whole thing in the long term in terms of livelihoods and so on? And are we providing alternatives in the form of land use, redistribution, whatever that might be? And if we do that, then are we just shifting the problem from one place to the other? I mean, these are all questions that I don't think we're looking enough at, but at least we're making a start. Equally, I find that with electric vehicles, there's a small study that was undertaken by a PhD student who looks at charging for electric vehicles and the cost of charging for electric vehicles alongside other transport costs. And especially, and that whole study that he did was prior to the increase in energy costs. And I can see that everything he found, which shows that people with certain travel patterns who need to travel a lot, tend to be the most affected by electric vehicle deployment, basically, by the widespread use of electric vehicles. And this is hardly within the radar of transport planning professionals who are looking at the electrification of private fleets. And this whole question just becomes far more important when we talk about increasing energy prices, which is something that all countries are grappling with. So again, no answers, but definitely a lot of evidence that points to the need for further insight and consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of great questions. Thanks, Aruna. I want to go back to you, Mark. And, there was one question in the chat initially, and I'm going to make it a little bit broader when you were talking about the super block in Barcelona. But also, I think that ties in with, Aruna's also idea of the low emission zones and all of these sort of, restrictions on vehicles in certain parts of our cities. There's always a big pushback. And there's always a big question about, well, what's going to happen with the rest of the cars, right? Are we just going to create congestion outside of this zone and therefore, not change air pollution at all? Or are we really going to affect, some mode choice, some behavioral change?
Yes, I hope for the latter, but we don't know. We don't have the data for that yet. So, at the moment, 30 new super blocks are being introduced in Barcelona, and there's some further monitoring on this to see what's going to happen. I mean, are people going to say let's not go into Barcelona because it's becoming too difficult to drive, and let's take the train or so, or are they going to go to the areas what are not affected? And of course, we don't know that yet. I mean, I think there is some evidence from low emission zones that people go around them, I think, in other places, and that you get a bit more emissions there, more air pollution around them. But it depends also, I think, by city where you go, what is the local situation. I mean, for me, it's more an argument not to focus on particular smaller areas in the city, but go citywide. The low emission zone in Barcelona is almost for the whole of Barcelona, so you don't have this kind of idea that you can get around it. And but of course, the super blocks are much more expensive to do, so they have to start in much smaller areas.
Yeah.
Hopefully, in the long term, we got 500 would cover the whole of Barcelona, but that would be ideal. But that's not happening at the moment.
Yeah. No, but it is pretty impressive, though, even to start. And I think studies like yours that can document the benefits. I think from a policy point of view, we always struggle with getting pilot projects, bicycle projects on the ground, being able to justify, right, to decision makers that this is a good idea for health, because there's always this kind of pushback, and people are going to say, well, you're just taking space off the road and all cars. But the idea is, it would be foolish and silly to think that no one's going to adjust their behavior. That
I think that what we've seen during the COVID-19, there are a couple of nice papers coming out. I think there was a German group was showing that cities that have increased their cycling lanes during COVID-19 saw also a much larger increase in cycling than those cities that didn't. And I think these are very nice experiments to show that if you provide people with the opportunity to cycle, they actually will come. We know the great barrier for cycling is that people don't perceive it as safe, and you need to provide safe infrastructure to actually have them start thinking about cycling. And I think these were some really nice studies to show this. Unfortunately, we don't have enough of these kind of examples.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe I want to close off with this because we only have 3 minutes. And there was a question about, COVID-19, trends on expected traffic. And I'll ask each one of you what you have seen from your cities. I know in Toronto, we don't really see a difference in the volume of traffic, but as Mark said, COVID was a great experiment in deploying active transportation. And we know people took to that and actually used this new infrastructure. So I'll go around Peter, Askill, and Aruna.
I don't have any data on it, but in my impression is that webinar like this, that you can have online meetings, at least it can potentially reduce flights, and that's good. And we saw in Oslo that the public transport traffic was very much lower, also in the beginning when we started opening up, but now it's more or less up to the same level as it was before, at least in Oslo. But I don't have data on it at hand.
Askill?
Yeah, I think Petter is right. So it's close to normal, but I think there's still a bit of lower public transport ridership than it used to be. I also saw some interesting figures from the public transport company here that the numbers tends to have gone down more in the areas where you would expect people with like typical working from home occupations to live, because there's a bit of a east-west divide there. So that's actually something that we're considering looking more into, whether we can, based on what kind of occupation people have, whether we can see whether that has long-term effects on particularly car ownership, which is easy to see, but also travel behavior.
Thank you. Aruna, any final thoughts?
I think the situation in London's a lot more mixed, where there definitely has been an impact on the number of people using public transport and more people driving because they're actually commuting less frequently, which means that they're more willing to take the effort of driving, which was part of the reason they used to take public transport. So it's a bit more mixed in that sense. However, during the pandemic, we definitely has been an initiative towards low traffic neighborhoods that several local authorities started, which seems quite promising in some ways, but I think we need to wait and watch and get more data before we understand how it's impacting things.
Well, great final thoughts. It's 11:30. I'd like to thank you all very, very much. Thanks to all who are attending. I think this was a great event. There's still a lot of questions we haven't answered, but I think we ended up also with more questions than answers today. It was great having all of you. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day for those of you in Toronto, and a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, Shem, I think you can go ahead and end the meeting. I'm going to jump. I have another call right now. Bye.